The call came in at 11:47 p.m., and Sergeant Kovacs almost didn't answer it. He was 3 blocks from the station, coffee going cold in the cup holder, radio crackling with nothing urgent. Just another quiet Tuesday in Kelowna, British Columbia, the kind of night where the lake sits flat and black and the tourist season feels very far away. He'd been on duty since 3 that afternoon. His back hurt. He wanted to go home, but the dispatch came through anyway, and Kovacs answered it, and that decision, that one unremarkable decision, would end his career before the leaves changed color. Paige Brennan had been driving the same route home for 2 years. Left out of Kelowna General's staff lot, down Harvey Avenue, right on Pandosi, over the bridge if traffic allowed. 14 minutes, door to door. She knew every stoplight, every camera, every pothole that the city kept promising to fix. She'd driven it in snowstorms and in August heat and in that particular exhausted fog that settles over a nurse after a 12-hour overnight shift. Tonight was no different, or it shouldn't have been. She was wearing her scrubs still, the dark teal ones from the cardiac unit, a unit she'd worked in for 6 years, first as a registered nurse, then as the charge nurse who trained half the floor's new hires. She had her badge clipped to her lanyard. She had her stethoscope coiled on the passenger seat because she'd forgotten, again, to put it in her bag. She had a cold Tim Hortons cup in the holder and a parking ticket from last week still tucked under the visor. She also had a service injury from her time with the Royal Canadian Medical Service, 3 deployments, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Latvia, that had left her left knee structurally compromised. A torn anterior cruciate ligament, improperly reconstructed in a forward operating base, and then improperly rehabbed when she rotated home. She walked with a slight drag on bad days. She couldn't run anymore. She'd made peace with that, mostly. The knee was bad tonight. It always got worse after a long shift on hard floors. She noticed the cruiser's lights behind her somewhere near the Okanagan Lake Bridge, blue and red in the mirror. She checked her speed, 47 in a 50 zone, and looked at her signal, which was on, and felt that brief spike of adrenaline that every driver feels before the rational mind catches up. She pulled over, turned off the engine, put both hands on the wheel. She wasn't worried. She had nothing to be worried about. Kovacs approached from the driver's side, flashlight sweeping the interior before he even reached the door. Evening, license and registration. Paige Brennan reached for the glove compartment slowly, the way you learn to move when a uniformed officer is standing over you with a light in your face. "Can I ask what I was pulled over for?" "License and registration first." She passed them over. He looked at them longer than necessary. "You been drinking tonight?" "No." "You sure about that?" She looked at him. "I'm sure. I just finished a 12-hour shift at Kelowna General. I'm a cardiac nurse." He didn't look at the badge. He looked at her eyes, the way the training says to, looking for the signs that have nothing to do with sobriety and everything to do with a decision already made. "Step out of the vehicle, please. I'm sorry. Step out. I'd like you to perform a field sobriety evaluation." Paige Brennan took a breath. "Sergeant," she read his tag, "Kovacs. I have a documented service injury to my left knee. I was medically released from the RCMS 18 months ago. I cannot perform a walking test. I can provide you with medical documentation if you need it. Step out of the vehicle." She stepped out. The knee buckled slightly when she put weight on it, the way it always did on cold pavement after a long shift. She caught herself on the doorframe. "Ma'am, have you taken any substances this evening?" "Medication, recreational. I take prescribed anti-inflammatories for my knee. They're in my bag. I can show you the prescription." "I'm going to need you to walk a straight line from that reflector to the front of my cruiser, Sergeant Kovacs. I've told you. My knee, ma'am, if you refuse the evaluation, I am within my authority to—" "I'm not refusing. I'm explaining a physical limitation." Her voice was even. She'd talked people through cardiac events. She knew how to control her voice. "If you want to confirm my sobriety, you can use a breathalyzer. I'll blow a 0. But I cannot walk a straight line on this knee, on this pavement, at midnight without risking a fall." Kovacs looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his radio. What happened next would be described in court filings as an escalation disproportionate to the situation. At the time, on that dark stretch of Pandosi Street, it felt like something simpler and older than legal language. It felt like a man who had decided, before she opened her mouth, what she was. He cuffed her. Right there on the road, badge visible, scrubs visible, 12-hour shift visible in every line of her face. He cited failure to comply with a sobriety evaluation. He cited erratic behavior. He cited, in his notes, that she had been unsteady on her feet and uncooperative. Paige Brennan said nothing when the cuffs went on. She had learned, in places considerably more dangerous than a BC roadside, when to stop talking. The Kelowna RCMP detachment processed her just after midnight. She was allowed one phone call, which she used to call her supervisor at Kelowna General, a nurse manager named Horowitz, who answered on the second ring because she had been expecting a scheduling question and instead got something that made her sit up in her kitchen in the dark for a long time after she hung up. The duty officer at the desk, young, uncomfortable, clearly aware that something about this situation wasn't right, processed her paperwork with the particular efficiency of someone trying not to make eye contact. Paige Brennan sat in the holding area and thought about logistics. Her car was still on Pando C. Her stethoscope was on the passenger seat. Her knee was throbbing in a way that meant ice and elevation, neither of which were available. She thought about her shift in 16 hours. She thought about the patient in bed 7, a 63-year-old man named Delacroix, who was 3 days post-bypass and whose numbers had been drifting in a direction she didn't like. She did not think about being scared. That would come later. For now, she thought about logistics, because logistics were manageable. By 6 in the morning, 3 things had happened. The first was that Sergeant Kovacs had filed his incident report. In it, he described Nurse Brennan as visibly impaired, unsteady, uncooperative, and potentially under the influence of controlled substances. He noted her failure to complete the field sobriety evaluation. He did not note that she had offered twice to take a breathalyser. He did not note that she had explained, before any physical test was requested, that she had a documented service injury. He did not note the badge on her lanyard, or the stethoscope on her seat, or the Tim Hortons cup that an impaired driver would not have been drinking at the end of a 12-hour shift. The second thing was that Corporal Adeze Nweke had come on shift. Nweke had been with the RCMP for 11 years. She had spent 4 of them as a liaison officer with the Department of National Defense, processing cases involving military personnel and veterans. She had heard Kovacs briefing the outgoing shift sergeant. She had listened to the whole thing without saying anything. Then she had gone to the parking lot, walked to the impound yard 2 blocks over, and stood beside Paige Brennan's car for a while. The stethoscope, the badge, the handicapped placard hanging from the rearview mirror, a detail that Kovacs had not included in his report. Nweke went back inside and pulled the dashcam footage from Kovacs's cruiser. The third thing that happened was that Paige Brennan was released on a promise to appear. She walked, carefully, on the bad knee to the impound yard, retrieved her car, drove home, and sat in her kitchen in her scrubs for 20 minutes before she called her brother. Her brother was a family lawyer in Vancouver. His name was Brennan, first name Alistair, and even over the phone, she could hear him going very still. "Don't talk to anyone else," he said. "Don't post anything. Don't respond to the detachment if they call." "I know," she said. "I'm a nurse, not an idiot. I know you're not an idiot. I'm saying it anyway." A pause. "Are you okay?" She looked at her kitchen. The dishes from 2 days ago, the running shoes she'd never use again by the door out of habit. "I'll tell you after I sleep," she said. The dashcam footage showed everything. Not the way she'd been portrayed in the report. Not impaired, not erratic, not unsteady in any way that wasn't immediately and obviously explained by a person with a painful knee stepping out of a car onto cold pavement at midnight. The footage showed a woman standing straight, speaking clearly, explaining a medical condition twice, offering an alternative test, and being handcuffed anyway. Nweke brought it to Staff Sergeant Obolensky at 7 that morning. Obolensky watched it once, said nothing, and watched it again. "Where's Kovacs now?" he asked. "Off shift. At home. Get him back in." Nweke didn't smile. This wasn't the kind of thing you smiled about, but there was something settling in her chest like a counterweight dropping into place that felt like rightness. The next 72 hours moved in 2 directions at once. In one direction, Kovacs retained a union rep, filed a counter-narrative, and told anyone who would listen that Nurse Brennan had been belligerent, had refused lawful direction, had stumbled getting out of the car in a way that any reasonable officer would have interpreted as impairment. In the other direction, Corporal Nweke had already contacted the RCMP's Professional Standards Unit. Alistair Brennan had already filed a formal complaint with the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. And somewhere in the Department of National Defense's medical records database, Paige Brennan's service file existed. 3 deployments, a combat service medal, an honorable medical release, and a surgical report on her knee that was about as clear a piece of documentation as you could ask for. Paige went back to work 2 days later. She put on her scrubs and drove the same route, and walked into the cardiac unit and checked on the man in bed 7, whose numbers had, as she had feared, required a medication adjustment overnight. She talked to his wife for a while. She walked the floor on her bad knee and didn't mention what had happened to anyone except Horowitz, who already knew. She was very good at compartmentalization. The RCMS had taught her that too. But the charge was still there, filed, official, attached to her name. Failure to comply with a lawful direction. And in the province of British Columbia, a charge like that, even a charge that went nowhere, even a stayed charge, even a withdrawn charge, could shadow a nursing license review, could complicate a security clearance renewal, could become the kind of thing that required explaining, years from now, to people who had not been standing on Pandosi Street at midnight. She knew that. She thought about it at 2 a.m, in the particular quiet of a house where no one else was sleeping. The CRCS review moved faster than most people expected. The dashcam footage was unambiguous. The absence of any breathalyser result. The test she had offered, twice, that Kovacs had never administered, was a significant procedural gap. The failure to note the handicap placard in the report was identified, in the formal language of the review, as a material omission. Her service record was entered into evidence. Her medical file was entered into evidence. 3 character references from colleagues at Kelowna General were entered into evidence. Alistair Brennan flew out from Vancouver for the formal hearing. He sat beside his sister in a room that smelled like institutional carpet and printer toner, and he watched the reviewing officer go through the dashcam footage for the 3rd time, and he kept his face professional and his hands flat on the table. Paige watched, too. The thing about watching footage of something that happened to you is that you're never quite watching yourself. You're watching someone else. Someone who holds together in a way that you weren't sure, at the time, that you were holding together. She watched the woman on the screen speak clearly and keep her hands visible and explain, with a patience that now struck her as remarkable, why she could not walk a straight line on her damaged knee. She watched Kovacs' hands, the decision in them before he even reached the car. The reviewing officer asked if she had anything to add. She said, "I offered a breathalyzer, twice." A pause. "That's in the footage," the reviewing officer said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it anyway." Sergeant Kovacs was suspended with pay pending a full internal investigation. The with pay part was the part that made headlines in the Kelowna Capital News, and then in the Vancouver Sun, and then briefly on a national evening broadcast, the way these stories do when the details are clean enough to be easily understood. The Civilian Review Commission's preliminary findings were released to the public 6 weeks after the incident. The language was careful, as that language always is, measured, institutional, appropriately qualified, but the findings were not ambiguous. The stop had been without clear cause. The field sobriety evaluation had been improperly conducted. The failure to administer an available breathalyzer test, despite 2 offers from the subject, represented a significant procedural failure. The material omissions in the incident report required further investigation. Alistair Brennan sent her the link when the findings dropped. She read it on her phone in the break room at Kelowna General. Between a medication round and a family conference, she read it twice. Then she sent it to her brother and wrote, "I'm going back to the floor." He sent back a single thumbs up, which for a family lawyer was the equivalent of a standing ovation. What followed was slower and less satisfying than the version people wanted it to be. The internal investigation took 9 months. Kovacs' union rep was good at his job, and the process was what it was, and Paige Brennan did not have the luxury of watching it unfold full-time. She had Delacroix in bed 7, who went home after another week and sent a card that she kept taped to her locker. She had 3 new RNs she was supervising, one of whom was struggling with the rhythms of overnight shifts. She had a physiotherapy appointment every second Thursday to manage the knee that had started all of this. She also had quietly and without announcement agreed to speak at a panel discussion organized by the BC Nurses Union on the intersection of veteran identity and workplace vulnerability. She had not wanted to. Horowitz had asked her twice, gently, before she said this. She stood at a lectern in a hotel conference room in downtown Kelowna, in front of 200 nurses and administrators and union reps, and she told the story plainly. Not dramatically, not in the way that invites a standing ovation, just the facts, the sequence, the decisions, the footage. At the end, a woman near the back raised her hand. What would have happened, the woman asked, if there were no dash cam? Paige Brennan stood at the lectern for a moment before she answered. I'd still be fighting the charge, she said, and I'd probably be losing. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when something true has been said and no one has a follow-up. The formal outcome arrived on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after a traffic stop on Pandasy Street. Sergeant Kovacs was found to have committed serious misconduct in the conduct of the stop, the field sobriety evaluation, and the preparation of the incident report. He was dismissed from the RCMP. He was denied the right to appeal the dismissal under the terms of the misconduct finding. His pension was subject to a review that Alistair Brennan, who had followed every filing, said would not go in Kovacs's favor. All charges against Paige Brennan were formally stayed and subsequently withdrawn. Her record was clear. The Kelowna detachment issued a statement about its commitment to procedural accountability, which said what those statements always say and meant roughly what they always mean. But 3 months after that, the BC Ministry of Public Safety announced a mandatory refresher protocol for field sobriety evaluations, specifically addressing the requirement to account for documented physical disabilities before initiating any evaluation. The protocol cited, in the dry language of government announcements, a review of recent incidents that had revealed gaps in training. Paige Brennan read that announcement too. Also on her phone, also in the break room, also between tasks. She didn't send it to her brother. She just read it, and then she put her phone in her pocket, and she went back to the floor. Delacroix had been replaced in bed 7 by a 70-year-old woman named Dubois, who was recovering from a valve replacement, and who had opinions about the hospital's decaf coffee that she was not shy about expressing. Paige had already negotiated a compromise involving a thermos from the Tim Hortons on Harvey Avenue. The knee still hurt. It would always hurt. She'd made peace with that mostly. She walked the floor anyway, the way she always had, the way she would keep doing, each step a small, deliberate choice to stay exactly where she was.